Welcome to the channel, everyone. I'm so excited to have you here. Today, we've got a story that's not only shocking, but incredibly thought-provoking, and I can't wait to dive into it with you. But before we do, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let's see where all our viewers are tuning in from. And hey, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss tomorrow's special story. It's going to be a big one. Let's get started. He tried to run down a royal guard with his car. What happened next will shock you. Jake Turner, a 28-year-old tourist, found himself standing in front of the U.S. Capitol with his two friends, Chris and Tom. The streets were crowded with tourists, families taking photos, and guides waving flags. It was just another typical day at one of the most iconic locations in America, but Jake wasn't impressed. While most people admired the U.S. honor guards standing in perfect formation, Jake, fueled by reckless arrogance, saw them as a joke. With his arms crossed, he scoffed at the guards standing motionless near the entrance. "Man, these guys are such a joke," he muttered under his breath. Chris and Tom exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that Jake wasn't just making a casual comment. "Dude," Chris said, shifting uncomfortably, "they're actual soldiers, you know that, right?" Jake rolled his eyes, dismissing Chris's concern. Yeah, but come on, they just stand there like robots. I bet if I nudged one with the car, he'd jump out of the way." Tom, looking nervous, laughed uneasily. "You're kidding, right?" But Jake, with a grin on his face, slid into the driver's seat of the rental SUV. "Only one way to find out," he said, tapping the gas lightly. The engine purred to life, and Jake slowly moved the SUV forward, just enough for the crowd to notice. "Relax," he said. "I'm not going to run him over, just going to give him a little scare." Chris, clearly uncomfortable, stepped closer to the car. "Bro, you're not actually going to do it, right?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. But Jake wasn't listening. His foot pressed a little harder on the gas pedal, and the SUV lurched forward. It wasn't fast, but it was enough to grab people's attention. The crowd gasped, and several heads turned to see what was happening. That's when Jake realized something was off. As he neared the Royal Guard, everything changed. What he had expected to be a harmless prank was about to turn into a nightmare. Jake's heart was racing as the SUV lurched forward, but the reality of what he had just done was beginning to sink in. The crowd gasped in shock, and a few screams echoed through the air. At first, it felt like a game, just a harmless attempt to mess with a royal guard. But the second Jake crossed the invisible line, everything changed. The U.S. Honor Guard standing at attention, Sergeant John Williams, didn't flinch. His boots slammed into position, and in a split second, his rifle shifted, and with a voice that boomed with authority, he issued a direct command. "Stand back!" The sound of his voice hit Jake like a punch in the chest. It wasn't just a warning. It was an order, and one that Jake couldn't ignore. Jake's hand jerked on the wheel, his foot still hovering over the gas, and in that instant of pure panic, everything went wrong. His mind raced as his body reacted, but it wasn't fast enough. The car swerved wildly as Jake tried to correct the skid. The tires screeched against the pavement, the sound unbearable. The crowd screamed, scattering to get out of the way. A woman yelled at her children to step back, and Jake's friends, Chris and Tom, were frozen, not knowing what to do. Then came the crash. The SUV slammed into the metal barricades with a deafening impact, the sound of twisted metal and crumpling steel filling the air. Jake's body was thrown forward, the seatbelt tightening against his chest, the airbags exploding in his face. For a brief moment, everything was silent. The world around him seemed to pause as his ears rang and his head throbbed. His vision blurred as he struggled to regain his bearings. Through the haze of dust and airbag powder, Jake saw it, the Royal Guard, Sergeant Williams, standing at his driver's side window. His expression was unreadable, his posture perfect, unwavering, and completely unaffected by the disaster Jake had just caused. Jake's heart dropped as he realized this was no longer a joke. This wasn't about a prank anymore. The guard was unshaken, a symbol of discipline and control, and Jake had just crossed a line he couldn't take back. Jake sat there, dazed and disoriented, as the airbag deflated in front of him, the smell of burnt fabric still lingering in the air. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands still clutching the steering wheel in a death grip. The SUV had come to a screeching halt. The metal barricades now crumpled in front of him, but None of that mattered. The worst part was standing just outside his window, the U.S. Honor Guard, Sergeant John Williams. He was standing there, completely still, unmoved by the chaos Jake had just caused. No anger, no frustration, no reaction. The guard was simply unbothered. Jake's breath hitched as he tried to process what had just happened. The crowd, which had been full of excitement just moments before, had gone completely silent. No one was laughing, no one was whispering. All eyes were on him now, recording, filming, capturing every second of his humiliation. Jake could barely breathe as the weight of the situation hit him. He had tried to provoke this soldier to get a reaction, and yet Sergeant Williams remained as composed and stoic as ever. Ethan's mind was spinning, still unable to grasp how quickly everything had fallen apart. The once confident, arrogant tourist was now reduced to a figure of mockery. His friends, Chris and Tom, who had been laughing with him just moments ago, were now dead silent. They stood at a distance, phones raised, still recording his downfall. They weren't helping. They were just watching as Jake's life crumbled in front of him. And then the sound that sent a chill down Jake's spine. The rhythmic stomp of heavy boots approaching. Multiple officers, Metropolitan Police, were heading toward him, their faces unreadable, their hands close to their belts. They didn't have to say a word. Jake knew what was coming. The closest officer, a grizzled man with sharp eyes, stepped up to the driver's side and yanked the door open. "Out!" the officer said, his voice firm, no hint of sympathy. Jake flinched, his body locking up in panic. The officer didn't wait. With swift precision, he grabbed Jake by the arm and yanked him out of the car. As Jake stumbled, his legs weak from the crash, he opened his mouth to say something, anything to defend himself. But before he could get a word out, the officer slammed him face first against the hood of the car. The crowd gasped, some whispering, others snickering. "He's done," one person murmured. Jake's face hit the dented hood, and the world felt like it was crashing down around him. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of his disgrace. The officer's grip tightened as Jake struggled to make sense of how quickly everything had gone from a prank to a full-on disaster. And through it all, the Royal Guard stood there, unmoved. His rifle was back in position, his stance unchanged. He hadn't reacted once, and that, more than anything, was the ultimate blow to Jake's ego. The situation was escalating fast, and Jake could feel the weight of his own stupidity bearing down on him. The officer who had just slammed him against the hood of the rental car wasn't giving him a chance to recover. His grip tightened on Jake's arm, and the harsh metal of the handcuffs clamped around his wrists. It wasn't a prank anymore. It wasn't some stupid stunt to go viral. Jake had crossed the line, and now there were real consequences. The officer yanked him upright, his legs wobbling, barely able to support his weight after the crash. Every ounce of Jake's confidence had evaporated, leaving him nothing but a nervous wreck. "Out of the car," the officer growled, his tone making it clear there was no room for negotiation. Jake could barely process the words. This was real now. His friends, Chris and Tom, stood off to the side, their faces blank, their phones still recording every humiliating second. They weren't stepping in to help him. They weren't defending him. They were just watching as his life went from bad to worse. Tom's voice barely reached Jake's ears. "You good, bro?" But Jake didn't respond. How could he? What could he say? His body was shaking, his pride shattered, and the eyes of the entire crowd were burning holes into him. The officer wasn't playing around. He spun Jake around and shoved him hard against the hood of the car, the metal making a sickening thud as his face slammed into it. The crowd's collective gasp filled the air, and Jake could feel the eyes of everyone watching him. "He's done for," someone whispered in the crowd. It wasn't just a bad moment. It was the kind of humiliation that stuck with you forever. Jake's face stayed pressed against the car, the dent from the impact pressing into his skin. The officer's voice cut through the air. "We've got a reckless driving incident outside Buckingham Palace, one detained." Jake's heart sank. It wasn't just the crash. It wasn't just the police or the crowd watching. It was the fact that his entire life was about to be broadcasted to the world. His panic rose. He opened his mouth, desperate to explain, to say something that would make this all stop. "It was an accident. I wasn't trying." But before he could finish, the officer's grip tightened. "You drove a vehicle toward an active-duty military officer. That's not an accident, mate. Jake felt the weight of his words sink in. There was no way out now. His reckless stunt had gone from a viral prank to a public disaster. The crowd was recording, the police were watching, and worst of all, the Royal Guard, the one person Jake had tried to provoke, hadn't even acknowledged him. Standing tall, unmoved, unbothered, Sergeant John Williams continued his post, completely unaffected by the chaos Jake had caused. And that, more than anything, crushed Jake. He had thrown everything at the guard and got nothing in return, and in the end, it was Jake, not the guard, who had lost. The humiliation was only just beginning. Jake's world was crumbling, and it was all happening in real time. The officer's grip tightened as he led Jake toward the police vehicle, the weight of the entire situation pressing down on him. Every step felt heavier, his legs still unsteady from the crash. The crowd's murmurs followed them like a constant reminder of his humiliation, but Jake couldn't escape it. The laughter, the whispers, the phones recording every second. It was all out of his control now. His friends, Chris and Tom, had long since stopped offering support. They stood in the background, still filming, still recording every moment of his downfall. He felt the sting of betrayal as they did nothing but watch. As Jake was shoved into the back of the police car, he couldn't help but glance out the window. There, just a few feet away, stood Sergeant John Williams, the very Royal Guard he had tried to provoke. The guard hadn't flinched, hadn't moved an inch. The officer who had arrested him barely acknowledged the man still standing at his post. It was as if nothing had happened. It was as if Jake didn't even exist in the world of the Royal Guard. And that was the worst part. The complete indifference. Jake's stomach twisted. He could already feel the weight of the internet's wrath closing in on him. As the police car drove toward the station, he pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he scrolled through the flood of notifications. The video of his reckless stunt was already going viral. TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, every platform was blowing up with memes, comments, and news reports. It was everywhere. Some of the memes were brutal. Freeze frames of his panicked face before the crash, slow motion clips with dramatic music, and one particularly savage edit with the "You died" screen from Dark Souls. Jake's heart dropped. This wasn't just a bad moment. It was now part of internet history. By the time he arrived at the station, it was already too late. The damage was done. The video was spreading like wildfire, and his friends who had been in on the joke had already sold him out. The memes were everywhere, and the comments, merciless, unrelenting, piled up by the second. "This man tried to run down a British soldier with a rental car and lost," one comment read. Another, "When stupidity meets discipline." And then came the worst one, a photo of Jake's rental car crashing into the barricades, captioned, "History repeats itself." When Jake was finally released, the damage was already irreversible. He stepped out of the police station to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly. The video had gone global, and every comment, every meme felt like another punch to the gut. His friends were nowhere to be found, and the only thing left was his shame. It didn't matter how hard he tried to explain. The world had already seen his failure. He had been outsmarted by the very thing he tried to provoke. Sergeant Williams, standing stoically at his post, had been the only one who didn't react. And somehow, that silence, that complete lack of acknowledgement, was worse than anything else. The internet would never forget him, and Jake would never be able to escape his humiliation. I hope you were as shocked by this story as I was. It's a powerful reminder of how a moment of arrogance can quickly spiral out of control. Jake's attempt to provoke the Royal Guard turned into an absolute disaster, and the consequences were far worse than he could have ever imagined. It's incredible how something like this can go viral and change someone's life in an instant, but also how the true power of discipline and control was shown by the Royal Guard, who didn't even flinch. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think about Jake's decision? Do you think he got what he deserved, or was this all just a huge misunderstanding? Have you ever done something impulsive only to regret it afterward? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let's talk about it. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next story. We've got more incredible, jaw-dropping tales coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Make sure to turn on notifications so you're the first to know when our next video drops. I can't wait to read your comments and have a discussion with all of you. Let's keep the conversation going.